start. We over time.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Keep on chat later. I'll be.
Sounds good.
All right. So hi everybody, and welcome to the seminar. And today we have Desiree Roerdink as our speaker. Desiree started her career doing her Bachelor to PhD in the University of Utrecht, and then moved on to do her postdoc in Bergen, and they loved her so much that they decided to keep her, and now she's an associate professor at Bergen. She's an isotope geochemist that is focused on a major challenge, that is the reconstruction of early Earth surface environments, and really aiming to understand how the cycling of elements between different Earth systems has shaped these environments, and was driven or has driven or been driven by evolution of life. So I'm thrilled to have you here, and take it away.
Great. Yes, thank you again for inviting me to give this talk. And thanks for the introduction. What I would like to talk about today is our study that was published 2 months ago in Nature Geoscience, and this is all about the early Earth and going back a long way back in time to try and reconstruct early surface processes and early weathering. So if we If we look at Earth from space today, then we see a planet with both oceans and continents. But Earth hasn't looked that way all the way in its geological history, and probably started off more as a kind of a water world until tectonic processes started to generate felsic crust. But when did that actually happen? Answering that question has of course implications for understanding the tectonic history of our planet, but as I will show later on in the talk, also has implications actually for the evolution of life on our planet. So when did the continents emerge above sea level? Well, finding an answer to that question, and to basically any of these early Earth related questions, relies largely on the rock record that we have that are preserved from this time. And so we find these rocks today in greenstone belts, Archean greenstone belts across the planet. You can see them here on this. Let me get the pointer on. There we go. You can see them here on this map. So we have the oldest ones in Greenland, and also some here in Quebec, and then pretty old ones in Southern Africa and the Campbell Craton, and in Western Australia in the Pilbara Craton. Now, the rocks in these greenstone belts, they tell us a bit about what was happening, of course, billions of years ago. So we can get some information about the presence of crust, or and the type of rocks that formed at this time. So, for example, the oldest mineral that we have found to date on Earth are found in the Jack Hills in Western Australia, zircons, and they actually tell us something about the geodynamic processes happening at this time. So up to 4.4 billion years ago, only about 200 million years after the formation of the Earth. These kind of minerals, they form from felsic melts. So this suggests already that we had some tectonic processes going on producing these felsic melts. This is what today's continental crust is made of. A bit younger, we have the oldest rock on Earth, the Acasta gneiss, or at least this is at least the oldest undisputed, or the rock that's undisputed has this age. Maybe we have some older rocks in Quebec as well, but this is the classic example of the oldest rock. Also, this one has a felsic granitoid as its precursor. Now it's metamorphosed. So again, telling us something about the tectonic processes happening at this time. A bit younger, we also find rocks that formed at the surface of the Earth. So we have sedimentary rocks in Greenland, the Isua Greenstone Belt. This is an example of some turbidites. And even younger, around 3.5 billion years ago, we find evidence for soil formation, so paleosols in Western Australia. Now, however, interpreting then when continents emerged and when crust basically became exposed at the surface of the Earth from these kind of rocks is actually not so easy. And there's several reasons for that. First of all, these rocks occur in very local outcrops. So saying something about sort of a larger scale processes like continental emergence is tricky based on just a single outcrop. In addition to that, some of these rocks are actually, their origin is quite disputed, so that doesn't really help as well. And actually, some of these also don't necessarily say something about the emergence of crust, but rather say something about crustal growth. Let's see, where did my arrow go? So for example, the zircons, they tell us something about the formation of felsic material, but they don't actually necessarily say if that felsic material was exposed on the surface of the Earth above sea level. So how can we then solve this problem? Well, another way of looking at crustal emergence is to look not at the actual rocks that made up the land or the physical weathering erosion processes, but to look at the chemical weathering processes and to look basically at the material that is produced by chemical weathering of land, of subaerial land. And just as sort of demonstrated here in this cartoon, we can do that then by looking at the composition of seawater, because this chemical weathering, the products or whatever is produced by chemical weathering ultimately ends up via rivers in seawater. And so a big advantage of looking at seawater instead of looking at rocks that made up perhaps the felsic crust at this time is that seawater represents a larger scale or perhaps even global weathering signature, of course, depending on the element that we are looking at. So we're looking at a potentially much larger scale processes that were going on. Also, the chemistry of seawater, we can record this in chemical sediments. These, luckily, we find in these greenstone belts that I just talked about. So this is a way of basically looking back at seawater chemistry back in time. Now, one of the most used proxies, I would say, for looking at weathering inputs into seawater are strontium isotopes. And this has actually been applied to chemical sediments throughout the whole of Earth's history. And it's based on the fact that continental crust and oceanic crust have a very distinct strontium isotope ratio. So strontium from oceanic crust, for example, coming in from hydrothermal vents, has a very low strontium isotope ratio, and material coming in from continental crust has a much higher strontium isotope ratio. Now, I just want to give you a little strontium isotope 101 to make sure that we all are on the same page. So I just want to spend a few minutes on explaining why this is. So the reason for a higher strontium isotope ratio in the felsic crust is because has something to do with the origin of this isotope, the 87 strontium isotope. So strontium has 4 isotopes, and only this one is radiogenic. Only this one is produced by radioactive decay of its parent isotope, 87 rubidium. So this means that 87 strontium is basically produced by radioactive decay, and the key here is that this rubidium that produces this 87 strontium, it behaves geochemically slightly different from strontium. It's more incompatible, and so this means that rubidium actually doesn't like to basically go into mafic minerals and therefore ends up in felsic melts. Now, it's these felsic melts that eventually form continental crustal material, and so as a result of this difference in compatibility, this difference in chemical behavior, we see that rubidium-strontium ratios in the continental crust are much higher than in the mantle that it's derived from. So basically, there's a relative enrichment of rubidium in the continental crust. Now, as a result of that, as I just said, this rubidium is producing 87 strontium. So when you are forming a continental crust, when you're forming a felsic crust from from a reservoir, you will increase the rubidium-strontium ratios in that crust. And as a result of that, the 87-86 strontium isotope ratio will increase more rapidly than in a reservoir that has lower rubidium-strontium ratios, because the 87 strontium is produced by this rubidium. So as a result of that, we have very distinct strontium isotope ratios in felsic material, the continental crust versus the oceanic crust or the mantle. Now, strontium in seawater is derived from both of these sources. This is a bit of a simplification, but it works for the Archean. So in the strontium that we have in seawater is basically derived from hydrothermal inputs that have a relatively low strontium isotope ratio, that have a ratio like the depleted mantle, and strontium that comes in from rivers from continental weathering. So crustal sources with a high strontium isotope ratio. And so basically, when continental weathering fluxes increase, you would expect to see an increase in the strontium isotope ratio in seawater, and therefore also in the chemical sediments that form in that seawater. Now, this principle has then been the basis of reconstructions of weathering over geological time, and I would say is relatively easy for the Phanerozoic, where we have quite abundant marine carbonates. So this period in time, even though in this graph it's not really shown very detailed, but we have we can make a fairly detailed reconstruction of seawater strontium isotope ratios. But if we go further back in time, then these carbonates become really scarce, and in the Archean we don't have really much carbonate around, and the carbonate that we do have is typically altered to quite high strontium isotope values because of post-depositional processes. And so for a very long time, basically there were a few sparse samples with a few carbonate samples with very low strontium isotope ratios. And so for a long time, those few samples have been taken as representative of the Archean ocean, and have then just been interpreted as an Archean seawater that basically had a mantle-like strontium isotope composition. And so from that, people have argued that, well, this is because there were no continents around until the Neo-Archean, until about 2.7 billion years ago, and plate tectonics started late. And so there's been quite a lot of conclusions drawn from that strontium isotope curve. However, 5 years ago, as Aaron Sadkowski and colleagues published some data on a 3.2 billion year old barite that suggested that the strontium isotope ratios of seawater in the early Archean actually were much higher than these mantle-like values that were suggested before. And so that this curve would basically be wrong. And so what we then try to do in our study is basically zoom into this part of the strontium isotope curve, because this is where it seems that something exciting is happening, something is changing. So what we try to do is basically figure out at which time this seawater strontium isotope curve starts to deviate from this upper mantle curve. So we also use barite for that, just like Aaron Sadkowski did. And there's actually several reasons for that. So this is a picture of 3.2 billion year old barite in South Africa. This barite is actually a great recorder of ancient strontium isotope ratios. So first of all, barite's very insoluble. It's one of the most insoluble minerals that we have. And so metamorphism is difficult to affect. It's relatively well preserved despite the metamorphism that has affected all the greenstone belts. In addition to that, strontium actually has a very similar ionic radius and similar charge to barium. And so it quite easily substitute for barium in the barite crystal structure. And as a result of that, we actually find quite high strontium concentrations in barite. And this again also helps with preserving the strontium isotope ratios, because it's difficult if fluids need to be very rich in strontium to actually modify the strontium isotope composition of barite. What is even better is that rubidium actually does not go well into the crystal structure of barite. It's too big, the charge is off. And as a result of that, we don't actually have radioactive decay of rubidium happening in the barite over time. So what this means is that if we sample barite that is from, say, 3 billion years ago, then the strontium isotope ratio that we measure in that barite is still that we measure today is still representative of, or the same as the strontium isotope composition of the fluid from which the barite formed, because there is no addition of this 87 strontium from rubidium decay. Lastly, a final great thing about barite is that we find several of these barite deposits in the early Archean, so this period that we looked at, 3.6 to 3.2 billion years ago. Here is an overview of all the barite deposits that we know from the Paleoarchean. You can see basically they occur in 3 different cratons. So these two, the Kapfel craton in southern Africa, then we have the Pilbara craton in Western Australia and the Dharwar craton in India. And so this is great because it means that we can study deposits from geographically different places. And in addition to that, we can study them throughout the whole Paleoarchean. So this is what we did. We focused on 6 of these deposits, mostly from South Africa, 1 from Australia and 1 from India. So that we cover basically the whole period that we're interested in. Now, before we then look at the chemistry of these barites, I should also say a few things about the actual the sort of the geological setting that these barites form, because of course this affects our interpretations of the geochemical data. And also here, I guess my point is to show that these barites are really a great place to try and do these seawater reconstructions. First of all, that is because all the barite deposits that we have studied, at least today, from the Paleoarchean are found in marine successions. So this is a picture of the Londosi barite, 3.52 billion years old in Swaziland, Eswatini, and these are actually interpreted as old pillow lavas, suggesting that we have at least a subaqueous, but from the geological setting surrounding this, a submarine setting. Other deposits are, for example, found in felsic volcanic clastic rocks or clastic sedimentary rocks, like in some of the younger deposits, but all of them are part of marine succession. So that means that we are basically in the right place to study ancient seawater. In addition to that, the barite occurs as stratiform deposits. So they are basically occurring in horizons parallel to sedimentary or volcanic bedding. This picture shows barite from South Africa, where you can see basically this sedimentary contact between overlying plastic sedimentary rocks and the barite underneath. And we see similar sort of similar evidence for stratiform syn sedimentary barite deposition in the other places. And so again, this is great because it means that we're looking at barite that actually formed at the time that we think it formed. So if we know the age of the host rocks, we can be fairly sure that the barite actually is as old as we think it is, as based on the stratigraphy, and not formed as some kind of a vein much more recently. Lastly, all the barite deposits are strongly associated with silicification and with cherts. So here is again a picture from Londosi. You see this white area. These are basically very strongly silicified basalts. So this is quite a large scale process. Also, we see cherts associated directly above the barite. So here is an example of bedded barite, and you see thick chert beds covering the barite, or here you can see some kind of what we call it cauliflower barite. It looks sort of like big footballs of barite surrounded by chert. So there is a strong association between chert, so amorphous silica, and barite. And so that is in itself suggestive of some hydrothermal setting. This is also something we see in modern day hydrothermal systems. Barite and silica are often associated with each other. And so what we did is then look actually into the chert to try and figure out what kind of hydrothermal system this is. So we measured the rare earth element composition of the chert. This is rare earth element composition of chert dikes. So these are basically big chert veins that terminate below the barite horizons. And what we see, the key thing to take away from this plot is that we don't see a very typical high temperature rare earth element pattern that you would expect, that is represented by this blue line. Instead, we actually see a much more sort of seawater-like signature with some light rare earth element depletion. Of course, this is modern seawater, so this cerium anomaly we don't see in the Archean because of low oxygen conditions. But in general, it seems that these chert dikes do not represent high temperature fluids, but actually represent more of a low temperature hydrothermal system. And this actually also makes sense with the fact that we don't find, for example, massive sulfides. We don't find really underlying magmatic systems. Whatever veins and dikes we have, they are quite limited in vertical extent. They're not hundreds and hundreds of meters. And so all the information together suggests that we are in a marine setting. We have low temperature interaction, fluid flow, perhaps along fractures or faults, as is shown in this, this kind of conceptual model. But all in all, we're not dealing with a very, very high temperature, hot fluid flow. Perhaps it's more like some kind of a diffuse venting system as we see on a modern day Earth. So with that in mind, we can say, okay, so these barites, well, they seem to be the right places to look for seawater, but we have to be aware of this hydrothermal influence. So how can we then determine which of the barite samples is the most suitable to study or to derive the strontium isotope composition of early Archean seawater from? So we try to look into this in many different ways. And the first one is to look at the actual barite itself. So the actual morphology of the barite crystals. And here you can see some of the samples that we analyzed together with their strontium isotope ratios. And we can distinguish between two types of barites in our sample. So we have what we call bladed barite. You can see this, for example, here where you have actual, you can see the long barite crystal blades. And we have granular barite that is, it looks a bit like sort of sugar. Now, first of all, when we just consider that as an indicator of its origin, then bladed barite is what you expect to grow at low degrees of oversaturation. Again, this is also something we see in modern day hydrothermal systems. And this is basically what you would expect in the Archean oceans. They were low in sulfate. And so you don't expect heaps of oversaturation with respect to barite. In contrast, granular barite, barite when it's exposed to metamorphism, even though chemically it doesn't change as much as carbonates perhaps do, but it quite easily recrystallizes into this sugary kind of texture. And so perhaps the granular barite may have been affected by some secondary processes or recrystallization. Now, we also try to get some hints from the chemistry of the barites, the other isotope chemistry, to see if there's any hints on which of the barites is perhaps more or less affected by non-seawater processes or non-seawater chemistry. So here on the left side, you see. Actually, we also see then a very clear difference in the chemistry between the bladed and the granular barite. So here on the left, you see the strontium isotope ratios of the barite versus their age. And in blue, the bladed barite, and in yellow, the granular barite. And so you can clearly see that, well, first of all the barite has much more radiogenic, a much higher strontium isotope ratio than the mental curves at this time. And that actually the granular barite has a much higher strontium isotope ratios than the bladed barite. when we compare the strontium isotope compositions and against the oxygen isotope ratios, then we see that basically all the barite kind of plots into the field where we would expect the oxygen isotope composition to be based on other studies. So this is the oxygen isotopes in the sulfate. We don't really see any evidence of hydrothermal alteration where you would expect the oxygen isotope ratios to be shifted towards this composition up the mantle. So in a sense, the oxygen isotope ratios didn't really help that much because basically everything is kind of consistent with a seawater composition. The same is actually true when we look at the sulfur isotopes then. So also here, strontium isotope ratios on the y-axis and sulfur isotope ratios now on the x-axis. And again, here in gray, the field of compositions that we would expect for seawater. Again, this is based on not on other barite studies, but on anhydrite nodule or gypsum nodules that were found in sedimentary rocks. And so also here we see that basically all the barites kind of fit with what we expect the composition of Paleoarchean seawater to be. The only sort of distinction that we see is when we look at the anomalous sulfur isotope ratio, so cap delta 33. Now I could talk another 45 minutes about just that, so I will not do that. But the key thing here to take away is that this is a signature that represents atmospheric processes, and from previous studies, we know that this signature decreases throughout the Paleoarchean. So basically, from 3.5 to 3.2 billion years ago, the magnitude of this signature decreases. And so what we see then is that the bladed barite samples in blue here, they show quite a strong correlation with these anomalous sulfur isotope signatures, whereas the granular barite samples don't. They're a bit more over the place. And so we think that this correlation can then be best explained by that the bladed barite is actually representing seawater, because we're looking then at a coevolution of sulfur and strontium isotope signatures through time, whereas the granular barite may have been affected perhaps by some secondary processes. And so because of that, we think that the bladed barite is the most seawater-like barite that we have. Now, having said that, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we are dealing with a hydrothermal setting. So we cannot completely ignore that. This means that as seawater-like as it gets in terms of strontium isotope ratios, we cannot completely exclude that there was no hydrothermal input into these barites. So we have to take this into account in our interpretations. Now, the good news is that we're not dealing with a high temperature system, as I explained a few minutes ago. So basically, not really like the system that is in the picture here in the background, but rather a more perhaps diffuse venting system. And so because of the lower temperature, we don't really expect a lot of elements being actually leached from the host rocks. And so the strontium isotope composition that we get even in these hydrothermal fluids probably still represents mostly seawater. Also, other processes at these low temperatures don't really happen so much. So for example, anhydrite precipitation in modern systems, this only happens above temperatures well above 150 degrees. So this is something we also don't really expect to happen so much in our systems. And this means that our fluids will have, again, a relatively seawater-like composition. We don't really lose the sulfate from seawater as we do in modern high temperature systems. So this is important because what we then try to do is basically make a model to calculate the possible range of seawater strontium isotope values that are consistent with the values that we measured in the barite. So in a sense, you could think of this as we sort of try to calculate like a bit of an uncertainty range on the seawater strontium isotope curve, because we have this uncertainty about some potential hydrothermal fluid mixing in. So the way we did this is we basically calculated which mixing ratios of hydrothermal fluid and seawater would produce sufficient oversaturation for barite to form. so this is then based on, these compositions are based on estimates from literature, and then we have to go on and make some assumptions about barium concentrations, because this is something that's really poorly known. So we assume that the barium concentrations in the fluids and seawater is at about 90% of barite solubility concentrations. And so this is, of course, the least constrained part of our model, but what we did actually notice is that with much lower barium concentrations, we just can't really get barite to precipitate. So because sulfate concentrations are so low. So actually we do need a fair bit of barium dissolved in our fluids. And so we calculated then saturation indexes. So any numbers above 0 here means that it's oversaturated with respect to barite. And so we see that we have mixing ratios of about 10 to 40% of our hydrothermal fluid mixing with the seawater that is expected to produce barite. So we then took that result and went on and calculate which based on those mixing ratios, which seawater values are then compatible with the measured values in the barite. So the idea behind this is what is shown in this model here. So the barite itself is a mixture basically of our hydrothermal fluid and seawater. Again, this is also something we see in modern day hydrothermal barites. It's not completely dominated by hydrothermal fluids. There's a lot of strontium coming from seawater. And so we try to calculate, basically, we assume this composition, we've measured this one, and we try to calculate the blue box. Now for this, the hydrothermal fluid, of course, we have to make some assumptions because again, we don't really know what this exactly is. So we try to calculate this. And for this, we assumed based on our relatively low temperatures that the hydrothermal fluid itself actually consists of about 80% seawater. This is based on experimental results that were done at 150 degrees, where this mixing ratio was observed. So we combine 80%, or our fluids are 80% seawater, 20% strontium coming from the host rocks. So then we use different compositions of the host rocks, both felsic and mafic, because again, this is just to sort of explore the whole variation that we might have had in our barite systems. And so with all the boxes known or being able to be assumed, except for the blue ones, we can then basically try to calculate which values of seawater work with this model. And so the resulting trend that we get then is the blue trend that is shown here. So the actual barite samples are the diamonds shown in blue, and the sort of the uncertainty range on the seawater curve that we extract from this is the blue field here. Now, what is really new about this work is because we have different barites throughout the whole Paleoarchean, we can actually then try to make some estimate or basically try to extrapolate this seawater curve and estimate when the time at which it started to deviate from the mental curve. And so, of course, you can say, well, this is unknown if this is a linear estimate, this is a linear extrapolation or not, but I think this is the best we can do. Basically then what we did is look at which point our seawater curve intersects the mental curve, because this is the time when the strontium isotope composition of seawater really started to deviate from the mental composition. So in other words, when input of material from the crust with high strontium isotope values became significant. And so based on our curve, this must have happened around 3.7 plus or minus 150 million years. So 3.7 billion years ago, plus or minus 150 million years. So in this sense, the fact that we can estimate this onset of weathering is actually really, I would say, unique for the barite record, because it's the only record that's really abundant enough in the Paleoarchean to do this. So here you can see two other weathering records that people have used. This is an example of zinc isotopes in banded iron formations, and these are trace element ratios in plastic sedimentary rocks. But you can see that there's actually very little data for the Paleoarchean. Here there's basically just sort of one data point. And also here, there's not really much data going on beyond about 3.2 billion years ago. So for these records, it's much more difficult to do such an extrapolation. What is also actually interesting to note is I mentioned in the beginning that there were quite a lot of conclusions drawn in this old strontium isotope seawater curve. And so, for example, this zinc isotope proxy that was entirely new it's been sort of validated by comparison with this old strontium isotope seawater curve, which we've now shown that is maybe not correct for the early Archean. So our data then basically extends the curve that was previously suggested for the Mesoarchean by Aaron Sikowski. So that's the green curve, as you can see here. You can see that is clearly deviating from the traditionally used strontium isotope curve, the one in black here, the Shields and Weiser curve. And that the strontium isotope ratios in seawater in the early Archean seem to have been much higher than what we thought. What we thought before. So in red, these are modeled estimates. So our empirical curve actually fits in between these two modeled estimates. So this is also quite neat. Lastly, you can actually see in gray or sort of light gray triangles, these are carbonate data that were published. And you can see actually how off, in a sense, the strontium isotope ratios in those carbonates are. So the carbonates for the early Archean, they've been affected so much by metamorphic resetting that they're just not really helpful in trying to estimate seawater compositions here. Okay, so let's see. We have this curve. Then the last 5-ish minutes, I would like to spend on trying to address the question, well, okay, great. So there was land probably from around 3.7 billion years ago, but how much land wasn't actually around? Did we have an Earth that looked something like the one on the left? Or did it perhaps look more like something on the right? And again, as I will show on the last minute, this has implications for our understanding of, for example, life and habitats on our Earth. So it's important to try and quantify the amount of land that we had in the early Archean. So how can we do this? Well, again, we can try to do some calculations. So we can make a mass balance, sort of a relatively simple global isotopic mass balance for strontium. This is what is shown here. So basically what it says is kind of what I said earlier, that the strontium isotopic composition of seawater represents a combination of strontium from hydrothermal sources and from continental sources. Again, on the modern, this works for the Archean. On the modern Earth, this is a bit more complex, but in the Archean, we don't have redissolution of carbonates and that stuff. So this simplified model actually is quite okay for our Archean Earth. So from this mass balance, we can calculate this flux of strontium from continental weathering based on the composition that we measured in seawater, because that's the one that we have inferred from our barytes. Our hydrothermal strontium, we can say, okay, this is similar to what we see on the modern Earth in high temperature systems. Remember, we're talking about a global situation now. So if we have high temperature hydrothermal circulation, this is likely to put strontium with low isotope ratios into seawater, similar to our depleted mantle. And values strontium coming up from the crust, we can take a assumed continental crust composition for that. And then so the only unknowns are the fluxes, but in 2010, Baltz-Camber published a paper and with some estimated hydrothermal fluxes. And so we use those fluxes to then basically use this mass balance and calculate potential continental weathering fluxes of strontium into Archean seawater. Now, that in itself doesn't really help you a lot because it would just give you a global flux, but that can come from a small amount of land or a large amount of land, depending on weathering intensities. So what we then did is take these calculated weathering fluxes, these global fluxes, to estimate areas of emerged land for different of those weathering intensity scenarios. So basically the way this works is that if we take on the modern day Earth, 27.5% of the Earth's surface is land, is emerged land. And so if we take global strontium fluxes and normalize this to the area of exposed land, we get a global area normalized strontium weathering flux, that is this number. So then say we would have calculated in our previous, as I showed on our previous slide, calculated a weathering flux that would be the same as today, then we can derive a land area from that for different scenarios. For example, if we say that our area normalized weathering flux is twice as high, or would be twice as high if the land area was only half of what we have today. If our land area was only 25% of what we have today, then our area normalized weathering flux would be 4 times as high. So we can basically sort of calculate sort of for different kind of weathering intensities, which is sort of what these area normalized weathering fluxes represent. We can calculate areas of exposed crust that would correspond to the fluxes we calculated with the mass balance. So along those lines, then that's what we did, and that is what this plot is showing here. So basically, these different colored lines are different weathering intensity scenarios. So the red line here is basically saying, okay, we have the same kind of area normalized strontium weathering flux as what we have on the modern day Earth. And that flux, such a weathering intensity scenario would require between, say, about 7 to 12% of Earth's surface consisting of emerged crust in the Paleoarchean. If we go to higher weathering intensities, which is something that has been suggested for the early Archean because we had high atmospheric CO2, so this would have perhaps triggered higher weathering, we of course get a smaller area of emerged crust that we need, perhaps 2 to 5% of Earth's surface area. So in a sense, we cannot really quantify this because we don't know what the weathering intensity really was. And whatever estimates we have, we don't actually then know how this would have affected strontium. So there's a lot of uncertainties here, but basically what it shows is that the previous estimates are actually, they're doable with our scenario. So previous estimates of about 5% of Earth's surface being emerged crust would actually work quite okay with our with a slightly higher weathering intensity on the Archean Earth. Now, what is, I think, a key point to take away though from our work is that, that doesn't sound like a lot of land, 2 to 5% of Earth's surface. This is, 5 times less is what we have today. But despite that, weathering had a major impact on ocean chemistry because this is what we see in the strontium isotopes. So even if there was little weathering, or even if there was little land, whatever weathering from that land was happening was already affecting early seawater chemistry. And that in itself is important because we know that emerged crust affects biogeochemical cycles in the oceans. For example, the supply of nutrients, something like phosphate, is supplied from land to marine habitats. So this could have basically triggered evolution of life in the oceans in the early Archean. In addition to that, we know that weathering is kind of like a climate regulator because CO2, because of the uptake of CO2 during silicate weathering, and so there are bigger implications than just basically there was only 5% of Earth's surface area covered by land. The weathering that was happening at that time may have had actually big influence on the surface environment in the Paleoarchean. And so with that in mind, it may actually not be such a coincidence that the oldest evidence for life is about as old as the onset of continental weathering that we found in our study. Now, of course, some of these are very controversial. So that's why I put a question mark here. The oldest microfossils if they are truly microfossils, maybe around 3.77 billion years old. A little bit younger, we have carbon isotope-based evidence for life 3.7 billion years ago from sediments in Greenland. 3.5 billion years ago, we have sulfur isotope evidence for life, and 3.43 billion years ago, we have actually morphological evidence. We have stromatolites, so bacterial mats. So this is all relatively early in the Paleoarchean that we start to see this, that we start to see convincing evidence for life to have developed. And so, you know, perhaps that's not so. Perhaps that makes sense if with what we learned from our strontium isotope work, that at this time we started to supply enough nutrients and we started to provide habitats for life, basically, to live in shallow marine settings. And in addition to that, of course, I didn't really put that on this slide, but we also see at this time that the greenstone belts appear. So the greenstone belts that I talked about in the beginning, they have ages from 3.7 to 3.2 billion years ago. So again, they fit with that time window when we start to see something is happening with the surface environment. Rocks are deposited on, or supercrustal rocks, so rocks are deposited on the surface. Perhaps again related to changes in tectonic processes that produced emerged felsic crust. So the takeaway point of then my talk is last slide. I hope I've shown you today that we can use the barite strontium isotope data to reconstruct weathering for the earliest Archean. Unlike the other geochemical proxies, we can actually for the first time try to or obtain a clear date on the emergence of felsic crust in the Archean and the onset of weathering. So we timed it at about 3.7 billion years ago. This is about 500 million years ago, earlier than what we previously thought, or maybe even up to 1 billion years earlier than some estimates. So this would mean that in the Paleoarchean, if the Earth, you know, looked perhaps something like this, life could perhaps flourish in shallow epicontinental seas, maybe even life on land. We know very little about this. Fed by nutrients from weathering of crust, and perhaps so the reason that we don't really find much convincing evidence for life much older than about 3.7 billion years ago maybe means that just in the Eoarchean, we just didn't really have favorable environments for life to flourish. And with that, that's all I had to say. Thank you very much for listening. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for an awesome talk. I'm sure that if it wasn't for Zoom communications, you'd hear a roaring round of applause. And questions. If you have a question, please mute yourself and ask away. Moti, was that a question?
It's not a question, it's just a comment. And the comment is that, okay, I like this talk very much, of course. And my question is whether they are also trying to do the 88, 86, because the group of Adina Python was doing the 88, 86 on barytes from, I think, they did not go so far back in time. Therefore, my question is if they have any intention to do it as well, because I think it really can add very, very important information.
Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you for asking that. I've been thinking about it, but I wasn't sure if this would really, as far as I understood, that the 88, 86, but maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong. I thought the 88, 86 was mostly reflecting processes related to carbonate formation. So I have to admit, I don't really know so much about this proxy, but we have thinking about it, and I've actually got a few replies after the paper was published from people that asked if I was interested in doing that. So it might hopefully, yes. Hopefully we will get some of this done. I mean, we've pretty much analyzed all the sort of the simple isotopes in the barite for now, the sulfur and the oxygen and the strontium. So I'm working now with Ilya Bindeman to work on also triple oxygenized dobs to see if we can get any information on out of that. But 88, 86 sounds interesting. I haven't. It's not happening yet. But
Okay.
More questions? I have a bunch. I'll just ask. So I understand. I mean, I think the evidence for the existence of continental lithosphere very early is compelling. But my question is, why does it have to be that the land emerged at that point in time? Can it be just an underwater continental mass that is weathering underwater?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So yes, of course, you can have felsic material in small amounts below sea level. However, there's several reasons. So from a rheological point of view, you expect felsic crust to be because of its buoyancy. You basically don't necessarily expect it to be below sea level. It should result in elevated land. In addition to that, it is actually weathering of felsic material on the seafloor. Generally, seafloor weathering is really quite a slow process, so it could have been very difficult to actually produce such an impact on the strontium isotope ratios by weathering of this material subaqueously. And thirdly, actually, we see in these greenstone belts that there's something called flood basalts that are really quite common, and so a lot of whatever felsic material might have been present on the seafloor was probably quite rapidly covered by basalt, by lava flows, by mafic crust. So it just doesn't seem. I mean, I cannot 100% exclude it. It just seems to be a more logical explanation that this has to be emerged crust to get basically the changes in seawater composition that we see today, to get the fluxes that we calculate and the amount of strontium coming in. But it's a good question. Yeah.
I have another question, hopefully good. So I was wondering, how is this record compared with the zircon uranium lead ages that I think are commonly used to kind of mark the extent of continental lithosphere?
Yeah, that's a good question. I had a figure, but I didn't include that into this presentation. So again, we see, if you, for example, look at the oxygenized dopes and zircons or the H's, you start to see that around 3.7, you see sort of a, well, not so much maybe in the uranium lead, but I'm trying to think, I think these are hafnium model H's, but you start to see some change around 3.7, 3.6. Of course, the difficulty in that sense with that, those proxies they just tell you something about felsic material formation. And sorry, I have a really annoying automatic light here. So, but yes, there seems to be something happening at around 3.7-ish as well in those data. This is just a little bit far out of my area of expertise to really say if that in that sense sort of makes, if there's no other explanation for that, but it does seem to match in that sense. Yeah. So
awesome. Do you have more questions? Anybody? Okay, I think that you're off the hook.
okay.
So I'd like to thank you again for an awesome talk. And if you want, I mean, I'll be happy to